Welcome back to the Spe Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin, as always, with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. Just in the midst of grading tests, so not too exciting on my end.
Ooh, it's that time of year for
That
teachers,
time
isn't
of
it?
year, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're excited to be talking to a teacher today, a professor, as a matter of fact, at the University of Notre Dame. Our guest is Philip Bess. And Bobby, I remember a couple of years ago when we were working together, you passed along to me a book called Till We Have Built Jerusalem, which I enjoyed reading very much, and we discussed at the time. But here we are talking to the author of that book. And we're also talking about an article that he recently wrote for the Theopolis Institute. So lots of interesting stuff to talk about today. Philip Bess, welcome to the Spe Salvi Institute podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have a chance to talk to you, and I want to start where you start with this article, and we'll link this in our notes, I think. But this article that you wrote for the Theopolis Institute, it's called "Buildings, Polis, Landscape, Cosmos: Two Countercultural Christian Humanist Academic Case Studies," and I guess we're just focusing on your contribution here. And you say at the beginning something that I think is a good starting point. You talk about what you call Bess's first law of architecture and urbanism. And it reads like this: all architecture represents the power of its makers and their aspiration to legitimate authority. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, the first thing I should say about that is I'm interested in the way in the emphasis that you put upon legitimate authority, because you read it as a verb, and I've actually been engaged with I've been engaged with colleagues who've raised a question of whether I mean it as a verb or whether I mean it as an adjective.
Mm.
And I think based on that conversation, and I've written about the idea of legitimate authority elsewhere, but I can understand why it would raise questions. There's an ambiguity there, and so I've been thinking about this the last couple of days, and I think that the way I would rewrite that, so let's see, say it again. All architecture symbolizes power and aspires to, and I want to say aspires to legitimacy.
Legitimacy. Okay. Yeah.
I want to make it a noun.
Okay.
And so I don't know if that throws the whole interview off, but
No, not in the least. And I don't know why I defaulted to the verb there, but it's significant,
reasonable.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very significant. Yeah, because so the feedback that I've gotten, and so maybe I should provide a little context for this. Peter Leithart is the director of the Theopolis Institute, and he runs an ongoing series of things on his website, the Theopolis Institute website, called Conversations, in which he invites somebody to write an essay on a subject, and then get 5 or 6 respondents, and then to give the final word to the original author to respond to his interlocutors. And it's kind of embarrassing because they've all responded with very provocative responses, but coming from all kinds of different directions, but which actually fits the nature of the topic, because the title of the topic was a little bit random, except, or for me, I was thinking of it as a little random, but it perfectly fits the nature of the responses, as well as the scope of what I was trying to talk about, which is the culture of building, from the scale of buildings to cities to their relationship to the landscape to their place in the cosmos. And so, and the 5 different respondents picked up on different themes throughout. And so I have to finish that. I have to get back to it. I'm eager to do it, but yeah, that's the background of where the invitation that came to write that essay. So, but all I want to say is that I'll add that people who have read it have had different responses to the word legitimate authority, and so yours is definitely in the ballpark.
Yeah, and maybe we'll get into the authority piece a little bit more after we kind of explore some more of what you do here, because I mean, in a sense, like a lot depends on who gets to make the decisions about what we build and what our world looks like, and that's something that I think is a hot topic for us to explore nowadays.
Yeah, very much. But I actually mean the idea with respect to building. All building represents power. I mean it in the most mundane kind of way. It's not even necessarily a reference to architecture. It's a reference to anybody who makes something, shelter, habitat, whatever, at whatever scale, that in order to make it a thing in the world, they have to have the power to do it. Whether it's the financial resources, the physical ability, whatever, it requires a kind of can do. So it's a very basic kind of thing. And of course it scales, right? I mean, it scales from, domestic building. It scales from the accessory dwelling unit in the backyard, the bicycle shed, all the way up to grand works of architecture, which obviously are much more complex things, and their intentions are much more complex. But even the notion of legitimacy, I think that when somebody makes something like that, makes any kind of a building at any scale, it's a kind of act of legitimation, and I don't even mean that in a bad way. I mean it in the way that human beings, the human animal, our participation we participate in nature through various kinds of reason, and in the case of productive reason, we make things. We're the animal that makes settlements that take the form of cities, and so it's an argument that I'm wanting to certainly extend into the cosmos and its relationship to the cosmos, but it starts from a basic anthropological foundation.
It's interesting in your work, like going back to that first book that I recommended to Andrew, Till We Have Built Jerusalem. Throughout, it's always in some ways the vision, the ultimate vision, or in some ways, perhaps maybe that holistic vision that is guiding the whole process of the making. So, and I love how you in a way, like you bring that, you make that more explicit than most people do in the fact that because of that cosmic vision, it implies a vision of who man is. It implies our relationship to the land, and in some sense, you point ultimately to a vision of the New Jerusalem. And living here, I'm living in Krakow right now, and I know, Andrew, I bring this up all the time, but you feel like this city, while it was made throughout the centuries, there is in some ways a vision that perhaps maybe it's not maybe guiding many people to this day, but yet it's in a way it's developed over time, and that's allowed it to have this continuity though. But the vision is at the heart of that. And so could you maybe like articulate that too a little bit? Because with the legitimate authority aspect, that presenting of oneself, it's like you want to be taken seriously, but by what criterion?
Yeah. So I think that the phenomenon of linking buildings and settlements to the cosmos, that's a fundamentally anthropological thing. And in this, I'm looking at it, from a kind of phenomenology of religion point of view, which I think certainly the Catholic view of thing embraces that, but has a specific take on its significance. But there's this great passage in the work of Mircea Eliade, who was a great historian of religions, Romanian immigrant who pursued his career at the University of Chicago. And in his book, The Sacred and the Profane, he writes about the way in which pre-modern human beings understood themselves to exist in a sacred cosmos, and that the the center of the sacred, let's see, the presence of the sacred cosmos within which the cosmos within which they found themselves and which manifested itself within them was, he says, it's always a center, and it kind of scales down. And he talks about how it can exist at the scale of a nation. And by this, I mean, he doesn't mean a modern nation state, but he just means like a kind of national cultural identity. It exists at the scale of a nation. And he said, like Palestine, it exists at the scale of the city, Jerusalem. It exists at the scale of the temple. It exists at the scale of the altar. It exists at the scale of the kinds of things that we have in our houses, right? The sort of private devotional spaces. It exists in many cases, and in many cultures, in the clothes that we wear. And in many cases, it exists upon our bodies and the marks on our bodies, circumcision or tonsure, or something that ties us, or is an acknowledgement of our presence within sacred order. And so, that's a sensibility that arguably existed until the advent of the modern era. And that is not a prominent sensibility today. And the interesting thing is, and this is something that I teach a course called Catholicism in the City, not in the city, Catholicism and the City, that tries to look at cities from the point of view of basically of a Catholic meta-narrative. But the arguments, most of the arguments are anthropological, natural law, until we get into specific issues relating to sort of the eschatological significance of cities, of human destiny, but also the notion of sacramental presence, right? And so that the New Jerusalem that is at the end of history is something that manifests itself sacramentally among us, and that's actually, I think, a sensibility that antedates biblical religion. I think it's a partial truth, but a partial truth is partially true, and so it's in the modern world really that we've lost this sense of the relationship between physical reality and being part of a larger sacred order.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I was reading a book about how in the ancient Roman household, they had to have like the sacred fire at the very center of it. And there was a duty to always have the fire on, but yet that was kind of the center around which the household, well, and then you could, like you say, go from the micro to the macro. And yet that will tell the whole cosmos. So it seems like, that meaning is something we're striving for. And as somebody, I know you lived in Chicago for a little bit too, but it always breaks my heart. For you, okay, yes. So I'm from like the Southwest side, and my dad worked downtown and at the Amoco building, now the Aon building. So we'd go downtown a lot, and it just, when they were building Millennium Park, and when they put this, whatever we call it, the bean now, at the center of things, I was like, wait a minute, this is, for me at least, this represents in a way the center of Chicago. And yet we have this thing as representative of our like the center of the city. So, but I know you've done a lot with baseball. And so I like to, maybe I'm jumping around a little bit too much here, but my mom's a Cubs fan. And my dad's a Sox fan, so I was always a little bit torn, even though she's from the South Side. But my dad would take us, out of duty to a White Sox game at Comiskey. But like, he really loved Wrigley, but he couldn't admit it as a Cubs fan. As a White Sox fan. But Wrigley, it just, when you go to Wrigleyville, you feel like you're just a part of something. It's almost kind of like the liturgical in a sense.
No, very much. I lived in Chicago from 1981 until 2005, and my late wife and I raised our kids there, and I think it was like the best thing we ever did was to raise in the city of Chicago. But Yeah, the baseball thing, it's interesting. I mean, the White Sox, the whole, um, let's see. Well, see, I was born in West Suburban Chicago and lived there until I was 6 and became a Cub fan before that age. And then my family moved to California in 1958. So I grew up in Southern California, lived there from 58 to 73, kind of peak California, went to college there. And then I decamped, and I haven't lived there since then. But California was booming. It was suburban. Dodger Stadium, the Dodgers had moved. Actually, the Dodgers moved to California in 1958 as well, and they built Dodger Stadium, and which is basically a Southern California suburban stadium. Although it was a baseball only, it is a baseball only venue, and but in the '60s it began to be multi-purpose things. But these were all kind of object buildings oriented to cars. If they weren't located in the suburbs, they were located in cities on sites where they cleared out a lot of space for surface parking. And I had actually not been to Wrigley until I was, or I guess I was 21 the first time that I attended a game to Wrigley. But I was on my way to Boston. I lived in Massachusetts for 5 years, and went to games at Fenway, and then I went to architecture school, and I understood that Fenway and Wrigley were different, but I couldn't have explained it. I didn't have a vocabulary to kind of explain it. Hadn't lived in a city really, and through studying architecture, I kind of came upon a vocabulary to describe why parks like Wrigley and Fenway and the whole generation before them that were built between 1909 and 1923 were different than the modern ones. And again, it has to do with demographic patterns. It has to do with the rise of suburbia. But I had this intuition. You would ask me about my interest in ballparks. I mean, I did I guess the first independent project that I did as a design professional was a kind of counter project to a proposal for what became the new Comiskey Park, which is a suburban model park, parked down in a neighborhood where they kind of cleared out the neighborhood to put the park, and so I could see that coming actually by that time, and I did this counter proposal that went nowhere, but I've had a lot of Sox fans. Sox fans and Cub fans generally don't get along that well. I mean, Sox fans I think take it a little more personally than Cubs fans tend to. But I have a lot of really good friends good Sox fan friends who are really good baseball, really smart baseball people, and they recognized sort of instantly the problem with the park that they got. And so I've always had a little bit, in my relationships with my White Sox fan friends, a little more street cred, right, than I think that the typical Cub fan might, because of trying to do an urban ballpark for the White Sox.
Sticking with Chicago, I admit I'm not very familiar with Chicago, unfortunately, but I would like to be if Chicago one day takes the kind of shape that you describe in the paper that we looked at. I wonder if you could tell us about this Our Lady's Plan of Chicago. I was so fascinated to read about this.
Well, thank you. There's a story. There's often a story behind these kinds of things. Let's see, I came to Notre Dame in 2004. I've been there 20 years. So I came in January 2004. And when I came, I was hired in part to be the director of graduate studies and to expand the size of the program. And because it was a very small program, and it was really only for post-professionals, people who already had professional degrees. And it had Notre Dame, which I don't know if you know, or I presume you know, but your listeners may not. It is really the only, and has been for about 30 years, the only major architecture school in the country that has a curriculum that's grounded in classical humanist architecture and cities. Although there's a bit of a tempestuous story about the relationship between the architects and the urbanists. I mean, there's overlapping circles of classicists, people who are classicists but not urbanists, people who are urbanists but not classicists, people who are classicists and both urbanists, and so it's a kind of an interesting history. But I was there to grow the program, and so we started an accredited Master of Architecture degree program that for people who have degrees in fields, undergraduate degrees in a field other than architecture, and they could come to Notre Dame and they could take a 3-year course of study, and then they would have a professional degree at the end, and could do an internship and get licensed. So my take on the makeup of the faculty was such that I thought it was really important to emphasize the continuity with the classical architecture curriculum. And I thought it was important to emphasize the architecture itself as in some ways achieving its highest, one of its highest expression in the context of cities. And that cities themselves for a long time have been subject to design. And that's for good or for ill. I mean, there's some great achievements in urban design, and there's some catastrophes that have been a consequence of a kind of hubristic approach to urban design. But we put together a curriculum, adopted a curriculum that gave everybody foundational courses in both classicism and urban history and urban design. And then they could choose a 1-year concentration in either classical architecture or in urban design. And then after that year, they would end up with a thesis project. And so I was let's see, I am not trained as a classical architect. I have colleagues, there who are really wonderful classical architects and teachers. But my interest was more in urban design. So and that turned out to be the smaller cohort. But we went through a series of, I don't know, I was the director of graduate studies for 10 years. And then when they changed the curriculum, that's a story, because the curriculum turned out not to be popular with some of my colleagues, I think, and maybe even my students, but that's the jury's out on that, I think. Anyway, so I was teaching in the urban design concentration, and we started doing a series of interventions in American small towns. Or American city neighborhoods, so or even college campuses. So the first studio we did was for actually a college in West Suburban Chicago in the Southwest, Lewis University. We did a master plan design, infill and development design for Lewis University, and then we did infill designs for Cooperstown, New York, for Northampton, Massachusetts, for the Historic Center of Ventura, California. And then for Skaneateles, New York, which is a small town in the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York. And so all of these were, they were obviously learning experiences. These were hands-on projects with representatives from these communities. And so we would go there, we would do a design charrette, and then the students would work on the project for a semester. And at the end, we'd give them a book, and none of these have turned into an adoption, a whole scale adoption of these kinds of things. But I would say for most of the places, it does change the way that they look at their environs. Whether it's a college campus or whether it's a town. And in some places, they've actually tried to adopt some of the proposals. So we started winning awards for these smaller things. And then I guess it was prompted by the centennial of the Plan of Chicago by Daniel Burnham. So the Plan of Chicago by Daniel Burnham was published in 1909. And so it was 2009 was the centennial. And I was kind of dismayed by the way that Chicago observed the centennial. Because Burnham is kind of a hero to planners, but he is a pariah because he was a classicist. He's a pariah to the architectural community largely in Chicago. And so there were a series of observances and celebrations, and ostensibly in honor of Daniel Burnham, where every little project, there was one by Zaha Hadid, there were projects by other kind of hypermodernist architects that were clearly a kind of thumb in the eye to the design sensibilities of Daniel Burnham. And I thought, well, we've been doing these small projects, but what would it mean for us as a classical humanist architecture program in a Catholic university? What would it mean for us to take on a bigger scope and scale of design project than just the little small towns that we'd been working in? And of course, the obvious model was Daniel Burnham, and I had my dander up a little bit over what I thought was a kind of disrespect for, or at least mischaracterization, I'll say, but bordering on disrespect for Daniel Burnham. And so I undertook this project with a series of studios, a series of graduate urban design studios that initially focused on Chicago, but then realized after we'd done this for a short time, we really realized that we really needed to look at it regionally, and because Burnham was looking at it regionally, and I would argue that the significance of the Plan of Chicago of 1909 is that it, in some ways, it's the first and in some ways the only, it's certainly the most extensive attempt to look at a modern city that's industrializing, that's growing, and to look at it through the lens of classical humanist design, historic classical humanist design. Now that comes at a certain scale. It comes, I think, necessarily a kind of Baroque scale. That Washington D.C. would be the other major American city that has that tradition, and Washington D.C. is the mall. I mean that is a very monumental kind of scale, and Burnham was doing a kind of monumental thing as well. But he was overlaying it on a Chicago that was made up of neighborhoods, right? And so there's this really interesting dynamic, I think, that you get in the original Plan of Chicago, where Chicago at the time that Burnham was working, and actually for a period between like 1880 and 1930, it was the fastest growing city in the world. It grew by 3 million people in 50 years, which if you break that down, that's 60,000 people a year for 50 years. And looking back, they did it in a remarkably capable way. That's a whole other subject. But the main thing that was driving, of course, was the commerce and the wealth that was being generated by Chicago's location and its business community, and the center of which is the Loop, and the Loop is a commercial center. And the sponsor for Burnham's project for the Plan of Chicago was not the city government. The sponsor was the Commercial Club of Chicago. So Burnham was part of this kind of muscular Protestant culture of the progressive era, and Burnham had a successful career and then really got into the urban design issues through his leadership of the design work of the Columbian Exposition of 1893, after which he was an urban designer. And again, the other thing that's interesting about the Plan of Chicago is that for Burnham, and really for the culture, the architectural culture at the time, there really wasn't any difference between architecture and planning. And it really wasn't called planning, it was called urban design. But they were all considered part of the same discipline. And it's only in the last 100 years, and really in the last 60 or 70 years, that we've separated the two disciplines, so that now planning is about policy planning and urban design is about formal design, but they really don't touch each other. Now I could say some more about where that goes, but I mean, I think I realize I've probably just talked for about 45 minutes, and so I'll take a breath if you have any questions, or you can keep me going about where Chicago 2109 comes from.
Well, yeah, let me follow up with that just a little bit, because so the history is important though, and interesting, I think, because we have, you have these figures, you have this case of the city of Chicago, but then everything changes after World War II, and the cities then become something totally different. Everybody moves out to the suburbs. So, but one of the things that struck me in your article, where, and maybe you can say more about just kind of what kind of you envision, or in like what Chicago could be. But like, one of the things you point out is that this is not coming from a place of like, oh, wouldn't it be neat if Chicago could be like this kind of city instead of the kind of city that it is? Rather, like, you're pointing to the fact that in a sense, like, something has to be done because the suburban stuff is kind of all going to fall apart unless I'm misreading you there. That kind of seems like right here you say Chicago 2109 presumes that post-war automobile suburbs in their current form will have definitively failed by the beginning of the 22nd century. So I don't know. I mean, it seems like there's a real there's practical import here in trying to reimagine what we should do with our cities.
Yeah, well, very much so. And you know, I mean, the project. Let me go back to a little bit to the context of the project, and if I'm not back to your question in a couple of minutes, you draw me back in, because the way that the project began to take shape, and we got some funding from from an organization that allowed us to sort of expand the scope of the work, but it it was intended for a couple of things. I mean, in addition to kind of being the challenge for us as a classical school of architecture to take it on, there was the history of the original Plan of Chicago itself on the one hand, but it wasn't a perfect document. So it was an opportunity for us, and this is something that you picked up on, that we're trying to think about this in continuity with Chicago rather than as something that's completely discontinuous, but we're trying to improve things. So there's a sense in which the opportunity for the project, as I saw it, and as I was trying to communicate it to students, and as we thought about it as they worked on it, is that it's an opportunity to critique the Burnham Plan on the one hand. At the same time, it's an opportunity to critique Chicago as it exists today, the way in which Chicago adopted certain parts of the Burnham Plan, but disregarded most of them and kind of tossed them aside. And then our premise, because of Burnham's own premises in this, was to take the Plan of Chicago, the original Plan of Chicago, as not as a perfect document, but as a touchstone, right? As a reference point for how we would think about what Chicago might look like in the 21st century, or actually in the 22nd century, the beginning of the 22nd century, at the bicentennial, and how that sort of was consonant with this classical humanist idea of human settlements, which is basically Aristotelian in its notion, right? That the in a certain sense the ambition of the project is to create a framework for inhabiting a metropolitan region in human settlements that range from the scale of a large city to towns to villages to hamlets in the landscape that exist within the context of an agrarian landscape. Because for Aristotle, a polis, which was existed to promote human flourishing, depended upon character virtue, but it had a number of characteristic features, and one of them was that it was always related to some kind of agricultural or a natural landscape that was a source of food, that was a location, for its economic basis. And that for Aristotle, the polis was always an agrarian urban unit. And so we were looking to take that Aristotelian, I was looking to take that Aristotelian notion of the city. Some of the students go along with it, some of them, not so much. Colleagues, not much interested. But it's working at it at that scale of a metropolitan region that would look at, imagine Chicago at a scale of 4,000 square miles as an Aristotelian thing. And the reason why it was necessary, we thought, to go out into the landscape, right, is simply because the nature of modern life, the nature of our environmental circumstances is such, and the way that we have gotten into the habit of occupying the landscape. It really, things like water, water management and things like land use management, these are the kinds of things that really aren't done well completely at a local level. And so part of actually, I begin the article in Theopolis with a quote from Oliver O'Donovan, and end with it where he said, part of what I found so interesting about that essay is that he was defending both the universality of Christianity and sort of globalism in that sense as it's derived from historic Christianity, but he was also defending, the notion of localism. And so he's asking the question of what is the scale at the local scale where, we feel at home, where we can flourish. And then he's acknowledging that there is, between those two things, he's looking for the sort of governmental unit within which things can be pursued that cannot be done well at the scale of a town or a village. So I mean, he's talking about subsidiarity, and he doesn't use the word subsidiarity, but he uses the word subsidium. He's deriving it from the medieval notion, and so it's absolutely intended as an exercise in subsidiarity. The way that we're thinking about it, and what he says, and the quote that I'm saying is that he's looking for, he doesn't identify, but he's looking for that sort of realm of governance that is even smaller than the nation, right? It's certainly smaller than the globe, but it's smaller than the nation, but it's larger than the polis, and so. This metropolitan region of Chicago was something that seemed to make sense to us. Now, the way that the design started to take shape entails a recapture of a lot of the landscape. So there's a lot of the work of the project was to identify circumstances, the way that the patterns of development that had existed in Chicago prior to World War II. What they were like in 2009 and what we were proposing for them to be in 2109. And so the history of Chicago is a history of development. Metropolitan Chicago is a history of development along rail lines. And so you have the growth of Chicago where it is, and it explodes in population. But as it explodes in population, up to 1940, really up to 1950, I think it peaked at 3.6 million in 1950, and then it started to decline. Today it's like 2.7 and hemorrhaging. But the growth out is a growth along railroad towns, old railroad suburbs, which are different from historic towns, but similar in that, except for the train station, which becomes the de facto center in the town, and it takes workers. It's the Industrial Revolution, so the work has become separated from the household, but the breadwinner the husband takes the train into town and then comes back. But in the settlements, in the towns that are organized along the rail lines, it's basically a gridded, walkable, mixed-use neighborhood. So it's like historic settlements everywhere up until after 1950, and it's after 1950 that the big change comes. Federally subsidized infrastructure, housing policies, lending policies, that a huge population returning, a population returning from World War II that gives birth to the largest American generation in a long time. We're about to leave the scene, but this population explosion there were government preferences for locating it in suburbs rather than in cities. And I have to say, there was in the most foundational economic terms, there was a market for it, right? I mean, Americans happily went out to live a suburban life in the aftermath of World War II. And I got to say, I can't blame them. I mean, you've been in the European theater or the Pacific theater. If I were there, I would want a quiet life, after that. And so there's the appeal of the suburb, and it goes a long way back. You can trace the sort of the root. I mean, there's a whole conversation that's going on today about the end of liberalism, post-liberalism. Colleague Patrick Deneen, Tocqueville, sort of famously identified the institutions that he said that he said the democracy generally, observing the Americans in their American democracy, that it has a tendency to make of us individualists, which was it was different than just selfishness. It was actually a kind of he calls it a calm disposition that just sort of focuses your attention on yourself and your immediate family, and you don't think about your ancestors and you don't think about your progeny. And he wrote this in 1835, right? And so he was describing suburban life before we had the means and the cultural opportunity and the economic opportunity to make it, which we did after the Second World War, and we made it. So that's a huge experiment in the history of human settlements. But what it did in the city of Chicago, going back to Chicago, is that the land use pattern in Chicago was, let's see, how do I do this? So where's Lake Michigan?
Yeah.
Yeah. You got Lake Michigan I'm reversed here. So you got Lake Michigan, out here, and you've got the city of Chicago, and it kind of grows out to the north and to the northwest and to the west and the southwest and the south along rail lines. And so it's these fingers of settlements, right, that become towns, and they settle. And what happens is you've got agricultural landscape and forest preserves in between these suburban rail lines, right, where the new towns are growing. And what happens after the Second World War is that all of those fill in with automobile suburbs, right? And so the map of metropolitan Chicago in 1940 looks like this, and what it looks like in 2009 is this. It's like it's all filled in. There's no landscape out there except at the outer fringes. And so one of the things that when we started out to do this, we didn't. We kind of discovered this in studying Chicago, and realized that other people had studied it too. But it led to the sort of basic policy thing, which it had to do with, and it's related to why I think, and I'm not alone in this, why I think suburbia fails. It's starting to fail now, and that it will fail. And it's the argument that's been made for a long time has been particularly by the new urbanists, has been largely an environmental argument. And there are obviously environmental implications, but I think that the more immediate source of failure is going to be economic. And it has to do with the cost of infrastructure and how it was financed, and how it doesn't generate enough revenue to replace itself in low density environments like that. And so one of the things that we anticipate is that there will be a cessation within these municipalities that are in the form of sprawl suburbs that are all single family, single use developments where the infrastructure, will be unsustainable, and so it will necessitate more compact settlements, and that's going to come out as a consequence too of demographic factors that we're not reproducing ourselves at replacement rates. We have immigration, but that's a controversial thing, and our immigrant populations are coming from places where their population is declining as well. And so I just think that I think the people who make this argument in the most convincing way are Chuck Marohn and his cohort at strongtowns.org. He's the one who really sort of looked at the sources of financing the original post-war infrastructure and what's happened to that since, and why most suburbs are not solvent. But it also, it's led to a rediscovery of like the work of in the theories of Henry George, and of taxing the rental value of land as a primary. I mean, the Georgists wanted land value taxes to replace all other taxes, but there weren't as many taxes to replace in those days. But I think sort of neo-Georgists are looking to make a taxation on natural resources as common goods that nobody should, in theory, own, right? But you can have an exclusive title to use for a fee, and that fee is the tax that funds government. That the theory is trying to shift more of the taxation burden onto natural resources, including land, for which land is a synecdoche for natural resources. And so that's part of our thinking too for the Chicago 2109 project. And one of the things that happens as a consequence of that is that when people are actually paying for the value of land, which will vary from place to place, but what determines its value is typically the concentration of human activity, right, that's on it. The more people that are concentrated on it, the more valuable the land becomes, unless it's, some spectacular view or something like that. But basically, I mean, George was really a complete market economist, but he was a socialist with respect to the use of land. And so that's one of the things that we take as a hypothesis, for thinking about how revenues are generated for municipalities in these new municipalities in Chicago 2109. So the local angle on this is that what we propose is that Chicago keep and upgrade, and in a few places extend its commuter rail system, and that it concentrate its growth in 4 kinds of settlements, and actually to do the same thing within the city of Chicago, concentrate its growth in 4 kinds of settlements, which would be major cities, which in metropolitan Chicago obviously is Chicago itself, but then there are 2 cities out in the periphery, Elgin and Aurora, that are of a size and scale that are actually defined as cities. And then along the rail lines are towns. And then out in the landscape that exists, because it recapitulates that landscape, it presumes a kind of shrinkage of the suburban sprawl and a recapture of those places, either as natural landscape or as agricultural landscape. And what it presumes for settlements out there, if the city and the towns are urban, the settlements in the landscape they're also urban, but at a much smaller scale. And so, call them by types, call them hamlets, call them villages, that we identify a set of settlement types that go from the least dense and smallest area to the most dense and largest area. So from the hamlet to the city, through the town and through the village and through the town. But hamlets and villages get located at the intersections of existing state and county roads, right? And there's a limit to how far they can extend. And that saves on the cost of infrastructure, because you've got a concentrated infrastructure around which it's centered. And so it really it recapitulates the way that human beings made settlements until we adopted this whole culture, this experimental culture of sprawl development. And so, we think that our argument is that there are environmental benefits to this, there are economic benefits to this, there are community benefits to this, and that's not even discussing the sort of formal and symbolic and representational aspects of the proposal, which is a kind of correction, intended as a kind of correction to the Burnham Plan, because the Burnham Plan, I mentioned that Chicago had this really productive commercial center, which became the Loop, but it kind of obliterated all of the sort of traditional urban hierarchies of sacred buildings and public space and things. It was all just real estate. And what Burnham proposed, he didn't obliterate that. The Commercial Club of Chicago was his sponsor. He was arguing that beauty was a good in and of itself, but beauty would also be financially beneficial to the city of Chicago. And he proposed this grand civic center with a city hall that dominates this. But what it was, it didn't get rid of the commercial center, but it was adjacent to the commercial center. So it added a center to it. But there was no acknowledgement in the plan of sacred order, other than a kind of view to the east, over the cityscape out at Lake Michigan. And so it became, it felt like it was spiritual, not religious. And so what we were proposing to do is, where Burnham created this grand east-west axis that was a civic axis, that was a second center, in tandem with the commercial center, is that we proposed a north-south axis that intersected that axis, and the north-south axis was a sacred axis, and it was in the same spot, that Burnham had proposed. The city hall was in the same spot that Burnham had proposed, which is now occupied by the Jane Byrne Congress Street interchange, which is where all of the interstate highways in the city of Chicago meet downtown. That's where Burnham Civic Center had been proposed. So we're reclaiming that land to make urbanism out of it. And this sacred axis that runs north-south is fronted by a kind of representative institutions of the religious communities in Chicago, right? So it's not the Our Lady's plan is kind of, I mean, it's large C Catholic, and then it comes from a Catholic university, at which there's more or less enthusiasm for this kind of identification, but it's definitely small C Catholic, and it's definitely in the tradition of American free exercise and non-establishment, and of course, and ironically, it's occurring at a time when sort of religious participation is very low, and demographically it's very low, but there's some cultures that are kind of unsustainable, and so I think that the human race is going to be religious again, or we're going to cease to be the human race.
Well, this plan is always, I remember I saw it back in 2009, because I come from an area right off of one of those train stations. My parents all along the Southwest line. So I'm trying to think of the station that my grandparents grew up next to, but then my parents grew up by the Oak Lawn line, and then I grew up off of the Orland Park line. And I've always loved the trains, but I've always wondered too, because I remember you compact everything around the train stations, that it would be ideal. And many of these apartment complexes that are going up in Chicago are precisely going up right next to the train station, just because it's convenient. But it seems like people want to live in, say, a walkable town and want to have all of these elements. So my wife and I, we used to live, when I was working at Mundelein Seminary and then teaching at Carmel High School, we used to live in Libertyville, and that was a little bit pricey. But we wanted to have a walkable town. And with my wife being European, she never grew up with, in fact, to this day, driving a car is like a chore. She doesn't want to do it. And so walking, I mean, she grew up in a town that was really, really developed by the communist builders, but yet they still had like a walkable community. And actually, despite the apartment complexes looking like the projects, they're quite nice. So anyways, I just see this though as like a sign for hope. Oftentimes you see all these, apocalyptic, almost like Blade Runner dystopian visions of the future. And so for like my generation, it's really nice to see a vision of the future like this and to aspire to something like this. So do you oftentimes find many young people, like where do you find a lot of the graduates at Notre Dame? Are they attracted to this vision that you're presenting?
Oh, very much so. I mean, we're a unique enough school that people seek us out, and they come and because they come for two reasons, I would say, two generic reasons. One is they want to make beautiful things, and the other is they want to change the world. And the ones that want to make beautiful things tend to gravitate toward wanting to design classical buildings, and the ones that want to change the world gravitate toward urban design. And one of the things that I try to tell them is that those two things aren't antithetical, right? That you can do beautiful buildings in the context of good cities, and it's win-win, 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 win. So, but we get students who they're hopeful. It's an interesting thing in the program. It's a Catholic school. We get a lot of Catholic students that come in. They're a little surprised sometimes. I'm talking about the graduate students now. Some of them are a little surprised that it's less Catholic than they thought it would be, and they also come in and they're surprised that it's a little less classical than they thought it would be. But there are opportunities, right, for all of them there. But the other interesting thing to me as a director of graduate studies was noticing how many of our students, we drew a lot of, a lot of Catholic students, and from some of I'll call them the usual suspect Catholic colleges, and I don't mean that disparagingly. These are schools that are putting out students who are intending to be, who are serious Catholics. But it's a kind of religion friendly place, right? So we for a long time we've gotten Protestants, we've gotten Seventh-day Adventists, we've gotten Calvinists, we've gotten Mormons, Latter-day Saints, we've got Muslim students, Hindu students, and it's something that I think is significant because I think that classical architecture, and including these urban traditions that are, that again I think are anthropological, right? Because the scale of neighborhood design that we do, we see over and over again that cities that are actually founded, right, pre-modern cities, there's a dimension that generally they don't exceed when they're founded, and the dimension is approximately a half mile by a half mile. It's the size of the Roman castrum, is the size of Greek cities, or it might be a little smaller than that. But the half mile distance is significant because it's about the distance that a human being can walk in 10 minutes. And so in the era of pre-mechanized transport, people made settlements where you were never more than 10 minutes from edge to edge and 5 minutes from center to edge. And that's just, and so these, again, prior to the advent of modernity, this was an anthropological thing, and they existed in different religious cultures as well. I mean, again, they take specifically unique forms given the nature of the religious culture that they're in. But the point that I find of interest is that they all have a sense of, these pre-modern cities all have a sense of kind of being grounded in a sacred cosmos, so that their religion is metaphysical realist in its assumptions, right? I mean, and obviously, not all religious claims are true in the same way or to the same degree. But I think what's interesting about pre-modern and pre-therapeutic religion is that it is metaphysically realist, and I think that classicism is metaphysically realist. It cares about material, using materials in the right way. There's a great poem by Dorothy Sayers called "The Makers." It's the preface to her book on it's either Constantine or the man born to be king. It's really worth reading because it's very short, and it's about a conversation between an architect and a builder, and they're arguing who's the most important. And they're working on a cathedral, and after they've while in the midst of their argument, the stone starts talking to them and says, you better attend to the stone, because he says, I can bless or damn the thing that you designed by being but the thing I am. So if you use it in the wrong way, it's going to mess things up. So there's this respect for material reality that is weirdly absent from the contemporary hypermodern culture of architecture. It's like the buildings are being made so that they don't look like anything else that's been built before, and so that they can be photographed quickly before they begin to deteriorate.
Right, and maybe not to be I don't know, morbid or something, but a sign of hope is that they're deteriorating. I mean, that people are forgetting about them, and when they're gone, no one misses them.
Yeah. So one of the criticisms of occasion that comes up of the Chicago, Our Lady's Plan of Chicago 2109, is that it's a kind of neo Robert Moses, grand plan, right? That it's being hubristic, but it's really not. We're trying to work with things that we find, but there's a moment, right, where there's some images that show the existing Chicago skyline and the Chicago skyline as we imagine it, which includes some high rises. And so we had to figure out what are the criteria for the high rises, the existing high rises that we want to show continuing to exist in 2109. And we simply took the criteria of it, is it a historic landmark? And then it was just a conjecture of, is it lovable enough and well built enough? Because it doesn't even have to be well built if it's loved enough to be, to be maintained. But is it lovable enough and well built enough to last until 2109? And if it wasn't, gone, right? And so we had this little Schadenfreude moment where we were, using the program and just getting rid of the buildings, right, in the building model. But the point is that in the proposal, none of Chicago 2109 presumes any land takings and sort of willed demolition. We're showing the existing buildings that we show, we think, are buildings that by somebody's criteria are loved enough and well built enough that they'll be around, which means a lot of the buildings are gone. So it's not a blank slate, I guess, is the point. But so big difference between the Burnham Plan and the Our Lady's Plan is that the Burnham Plan was executed when Chicago was extraordinarily wealthy, and the Chicago 2109 plan presumes that we're working out of a sense of a kind of chastened sense of having to regroup and do better with what we've got, and work within limited means. But arguably the best things that human beings have ever made have always been done, foundationally through limited means. So.
Yeah, we had a guest on recently. We were talking about this matter, and he made the point. He lives in Sweden, and he made the point that he grew up in Sweden being told we used to be this very poor country, and now we're this very rich country. But it turns out, when you look at the things they built in the past, they're much better. So how are we a rich country? How are we a better country than we were when we made things? When our ancestors made things.
Right. Well, we don't recognize material things. We don't recognize what wealth is, right? I mean, buildings are wealth. So it's like the Catholic Church. It's the Catholic parishes own all this real estate, and closed up parishes, and too many bishops look at this as a liability, and it's totally an asset, which is actually what the second project is about in the Theopolis Institute project. So paper. So. Yeah, interesting stuff. So the guy, your interview for the guy from Sweden, who I didn't know of. I just started to listen to it. I'm very anxious to listen to that.
Yeah, Michael Diamant is his name. Hello, Michael, if you're listening. And he's engaged in a really, really interesting project to kind of shine light throughout the world on new classical architecture, essentially. A sign of encouragement, to be sure.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Professor, I'm afraid we're out of time. So maybe next time we can talk about the second part of the plan. I wish we had time to get into it, but I for one am really fascinated to hear all of this about Chicago and about the first part of the plan. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. My students will smile if they listen to this at the amount of time that I take talking, but not be surprised. So I'd love to come back if you're ready, if you want to do another round. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. We're building a library of conversations here at the Spe Salvi Institute, and we're happy to add you to the shelves, at least in the first volume. So. So thanks again.
God bless you in this project that you're doing. It's very heartening. So.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And to our listeners and viewers, we hope that you enjoyed this conversation and that you'll share it and promote what we're doing here. Be sure to give us that 5-star rating on Apple and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And check out our website, spesalviinstitute.com, to sign up for our emails so you don't miss anything. Until next time, God bless and live in hope.